My name is Carrie Pendergrass, and that summer, when I was 22, burned through my life like acid. It all started with one decision my family made, and with that decision, they cut me out of theirs. Betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it breeds silence. Without scenes, without slamming doors, without words. Just 10 minutes at a gas station somewhere in the Colorado desert, and the world I knew ended. I grew up in a house where surviving meant being invisible. My father, Travis, owned a hardware store and kept me there, not out of kindness, but to make sure I was on the job. The pay was peanuts, the conversation was all orders. He called college a scam for lazy people. Work, he said, and don't try to be clever. So I worked, silently, swallowed. And my brother Chase was his pride. Laughter, athleticism, eternal confidence. If Dad was the sun, then Chase was the ray that illuminated everything. And I was just a shadow, undeserving of the light. Mom, Lena, pretended to keep her composure. "That's enough, boys," she'd mutter when they teased me. But there was always a nervous chuckle in her voice. She didn't want peace. She wanted silence. So when Dad suddenly announced we were going to my uncle's wedding in Colorado, I was wary. We'd never traveled together before. Family trips weren't our tradition. They were like a foreign language. But I had no choice. By the third day of the trip, I was going crazy. I was lost in the backseat of the Suburban, drowning in bags and trash. Dad and Chase were making fun of me, as always. "Did the thrift store pay you to take that t-shirt?" my brother laughed. "Carrie tastes like old newspaper," my father added. I remained silent, staring out the window. If I'd cried, they would have been overjoyed. When we stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, I sensed something was wrong. The ground was flat as a table. The air was thin, like breathing through pain. "I'm going to the bathroom," I said. "Just make it quick," my father snapped. I didn't take my phone or wallet. It all seemed fleeting. In the bathroom, a cracked mirror reflected a tortured version of myself. A faded t-shirt, ripped jeans, old sneakers. The gaze of someone who had long since stopped believing they were even being seen. When I stepped out, the sun blinded me, and the silence struck my temples. The car was gone. Not them, not a trace. At first I laughed, silly, nervously. I thought they were playing a joke. I walked around the building, called his name, softly at first, then louder. "Travis? Chase? Mom?" There was no answer, only the wind. An hour passed. A truck pulled up and the driver looked out. "Everything okay, miss?" "Yeah, just waiting for my boyfriend," I lied. He nodded and drove off. And then the silence suddenly made sense. They hadn't lost me. They hadn't forgotten me. They had left on purpose. They'd abandoned me. I sat down on the curb. The world shattered into pieces. A cold stone in my chest, salt in my throat. I wanted to call, beg, fix. But who? The people for whom I'd always been unnecessary? Their voices echoed in my head, mockingly. "She's probably crying already. She'll figure it out if she's not completely stupid. She'll be okay, right?" No, it won't. I stood up. I approached the woman with the children. My voice trembled. "Can I have your phone number? I need to call the women's shelter in Grand Junction. Not my mom, not my dad, not my brother, the shelter." She hesitated, but handed me the phone. I made the call, and when the woman offered me a ride, I accepted. That night, I lay on a narrow mattress in the shelter, staring at the ceiling, cracked like old leather. The air smelled of soap and pain. But somewhere beneath that pain, something new glimmered, tiny, stubborn. Hope. I wiped away my tears and whispered, "You wanted to see if I could cope alone? Well, look." The first 3 nights were like living inside a bruise. Everything hurt, everything ached. I avoided even kind people. When the volunteers asked, "Are you okay?" I thought they'd laugh, but they didn't. They just listened. They were just there. On the 3rd day, I met Jenny, a social worker with eyes that held no pity, only understanding. I told her everything. She didn't gasp or look away. She just nodded. People leave in different ways. You don't need to explain their choices. You just need to figure out what to do next. She pulled out a list of job openings, a bus schedule, a coupon for work boots. You don't have to start your life over, Carrie. Just start living. I began. That same night, I started my first shift at a highway diner from midnight to 8 in the morning. The air there was thick with grease and fatigue. Steam from the fryer burned my hands. The floor glistened with oil and slippery as ice. The manager commanded with such confidence, as if he owned not only the establishment, but my body as well. I fell twice. I got up silently. I didn't complain. Pain wasn't an enemy to me, but an old friend. The difference was that now there was meaning behind it. Every burn, every blister, every sleepless night, all of it propelled me forward, not to nowhere. After my shift, I took the bus to a dilapidated house on the outskirts where a quiet mechanic named CJ rented out a room. He was about 50 years old with hands perpetually stained with oil and a dog named Roxy. His rules were short, like survival instructions. Pay on time and leave the dog alone. He didn't ask where I was from. He didn't inquire why I only had one duffel bag. He didn't look me in the eye for long, and that earned my trust faster than anyone. The room was tiny, with a bed that creaked with every breath, a flickering lamp, and a dresser with a drawer that kept getting stuck. But after shelters and other people's mattresses, this place felt like a palace, my first space of my own, with a door I could close from the inside. 2 weeks later, I found a second job, unloading trucks at a hardware store. The manager was a woman named Lisa, strong, tired, but kind. On my first day, she handed me a cup of free coffee and said, "You look like you need it." That phrase almost made my chin tremble. Sometimes, kindness hurts more than rudeness. I lived as if I didn't exist. No social media, no phone calls, no attempts to find out how they were doing. I simply disappeared from their world. Sometimes, late at night, I caught myself wondering for a second, what if they'd returned to the parking lot? Maybe they were looking for me? But the memory of that silent emptiness brought me back to reality. No, they hadn't returned. They never would have returned. A month later, I bought myself a push-button phone. 2 months later, I stopped eating noodles. 3 months later, I started reading again. Not novels, books that taught me how to survive in numbers and code, finance, technology, programming, philosophy. Late at night, I'd sit cross-legged on my bed, absorbing every word, as if building a foundation on which no one could control me anymore. One night in the library, I came across a forum. Self-taught software development, no diploma. My heart sank. No diploma, no permission, no grades, just me and the path I could forge myself. I downloaded free courses, HTML, CSS, Python, Git. I made mistakes all the time. The code wouldn't run, the websites would crash, and one day I was quietly crying right over the keyboard. But the next day, I opened my laptop again, and again, and again. Gradually, the errors stopped being catastrophes and became steps. My websites, at first ugly, then tolerable, then functional. 6 months later, I took my first order, a simple blog for $50. When the money arrived, I stared at the screen and couldn't breathe. This wasn't just payment. This was proof. I can do it. At the diner, they called me reliable. At the store, Lisa trusted me with her keys. CJ knocked on the door and said Roxy missed me. For the first time in my life, people liked me just like that, without effort, without a role, without the mask of convenience. I was becoming different, not broken, real. And then one night, in the light of the screen, I realized if they ever came looking for that girl they abandoned at the gas station, they wouldn't find her. She died there, in the desert. I am the one born in her place. A year later, I barely recognized myself. Not louder, not braver, just firmer. My life was simple. Work, study, sleep. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Freedom seeped in little by little, like light through curtains in the morning. When I saved up, I moved out of CJ's. I rented a small studio apartment, peeling paint on the walls, a kitchen the size of a suitcase. But that first night, lying on the mattress I'd bought with my own money, I cried with relief from the silence that belonged only to me. Then I bought a sofa. Gray, cheap, but mine. And when I lay down on it, I felt as if I were holding proof of my existence. 6 months later, Aisha, a woman running a small startup, offered me a permanent contract. I admitted I didn't have a degree. She simply smiled. "I'm interested in results, Carrie, and you have results." Those words were worth more to me than any certificate. For the first time, I heard not praise, but recognition. Gradually, I started showing up at developer meetups, making new acquaintances. That's how I met Evan Brooks. He was different, without an ego, without the desire to prove he was smarter. He noticed details, the way I intertwined my fingers when I was anxious, and always chose a position with my back to the wall. He didn't ask why, he simply sat next to me, covering my flank. His ex, Aubrey Hale, sometimes showed up at the same meetings, tall, with impeccable posture, as if from another world. One day, she looked at me a little condescendingly, but Evan moved closer. That was enough. I was in no hurry to open up. People's kindness often turned out to be disguised control. But Evan waited. He didn't press. By the second year, I was no longer surviving. I was living. I had a job, savings, friends, my own home, and most importantly, peace. No one from my family wrote. Not once. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas. They didn't put me on the wanted list. They didn't ask where I was. They simply crossed me off and considered it a relief. They didn't forget. They just chose not to remember. The turning point came at a conference in Denver. My first real conference, with a badge and dress code scrounged together from a thrift store. I was standing by the food truck when someone said behind me, "Carrie? Carrie Pendergrass?" I turned around. Evan Sullivan, the guy from high school, always good-natured. "Wow," he said, "you look amazing. Where have you been? Everyone thought something terrible had happened to you." "Terrible?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Yes. Your family said you ran away, just disappeared. Chase said you were unstable and your parents were going crazy with worry. Everyone thought you abandoned them." Abandoned them. That's how it was. They rewrote history. They made the torturers into victims and the victims into monsters. I smiled, subtly, evenly, almost calmly. "Well," I said, "something terrible did happen, but I'm glad it did." He paused as if he wanted to add something, but remained silent. And I stood there, listening to my insides twist. They didn't just abandon me. They erased me, rewrote the past like a convenient fairy tale. Late that night, looking out the hotel window at the twinkling lights of Denver, I whispered, "You didn't just abandon me. You tried to erase me." But people aren't erased. Sometimes, when they're erased, they come back radiant. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a cozy coffee shop in my city. Brick walls, soft lighting, soft jazz. In front of me was a laptop with the code I'd been poring over for an hour. Everything was in its place. Even my breathing had become even. And suddenly the bell above the door rang, as if someone had cut the thread of silence. A familiar voice asked for black coffee, leaving room for cream. For a moment, the world ceased to exist. I knew that timbre, that certainty, that heaviness that once made me want to disappear. Travis Pendergrass, My father. The man who one day simply drove away without looking back. I looked up. He had aged. His skin had grown dull, his eyes dull, but the same denim jacket, the same one he'd left me in on the side of the road. Our gazes met for a second, and that was enough. He recognized. I did too. He froze and turned away. He left with the coffee. He didn't say a word. And for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. No fear, no pain, only a strange clarity, as if the glass inside had finally become transparent. I simply watched him leave and thought, I've outlived you. He walked out of the coffee shop, but for the first time, it wasn't me who was abandoned. It was him. I thought that would be the end, that silent point beyond which a new life begins. The universe probably wanted to check. Are you sure you let go? And I answered wordlessly, yes, definitely. But life has a strange sense of time. 3 weeks later, I was sitting there again, at my desk with my laptop and a latte, working on code for an Austin startup. Everything was calm. I finally felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. The bell rang again. I didn't even look up. But the voice. Some voices are ingrained in you forever. Carrie. My chest tightened, but not from fear, just the chill of recognition. Boundaries, my new walls, rose automatically. I closed the laptop and looked up. Travis stood there, no longer the colossus, the storm from my childhood, just a person, ridiculously small, lost. He approached my table with the expression one wears when approaching dogs that might bite. He paused, as if hesitating. Carrie, he repeated, more quietly. Travis, I replied. He flinched. For the first time, I called him by name. The words seemed to fall upon him like the weight of recognition. He sank into a chair without waiting for an invitation. I didn't stop him. There was silence. You look well, he managed to say. His voice wavered. I remained silent. I wasn't sure it was you last time, he began hesitantly. I wanted to come over, but... I remained silent. His gaze darted around the coffee shop as if searching for that girl he could stare down, the one who was afraid to breathe loudly. But she no longer existed. He clasped his hands. We didn't know you were here. I didn't end up here, I said quietly. I built this, myself. The words struck him. For the first time, I saw confusion in his eyes, not strength, as if he was just now realizing exactly who he'd lost. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Your mother, she misses you. Chase, too. I let out a weak breath. No laughter, no pain, just a statement. They don't miss me, I said. They miss the one who stayed silent, the one who made them feel right. His jaw tensed. It's unfair. Like what you did back then, but you did it anyway. He swallowed. It was a joke, he muttered. We didn't think it would go this far. I froze. You left me alone in the middle of the highway, without a phone, without money, without documents, and you drove away. He looked away, his lips trembling, but not with remorse, more like shame at having to say it out loud. That shouldn't have happened, he muttered. A joke is when everyone laughs, I said. I wasn't laughing. The silence grew between us again. People around us drank coffee, flipped through feeds, talked, and no one knew that years of betrayal, shame, and unspoken truths sat at this table. He leaned closer. What was the worst part, Carrie? I looked straight at him. Not the abandonment, not the fear, not the loneliness. He held his breath. The worst part was realizing that not a single person in that car wavered, not a single one. You all thought it was normal, leaving. He looked at me as if I'd already made up my mind. But there was no gloating in me. There was only relief, a lightness I'd never known before. I didn't, he muttered. Too late, I replied coldly. He closed his eyes for a moment, then tried to speak again. You should have called. We would have come back. I stood up, putting my laptop in my backpack. History can't be rewritten retroactively, I said. You're not a hero, not even a villain. I looked him straight in the eyes. You're a footnote. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to object, but I was already heading for the door. As I stepped outside, I didn't run, didn't tremble, didn't look back. I just walked. I walked in a way I never could in his presence. I waited for him to follow me. He didn't. Sometimes you lose people, not when they leave, but when you realize you don't need them. After that meeting, Travis never tried to contact me again. No calls, no letters, no trembling apologies. And I didn't wait. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some wounds don't heal with just the word sorry. And some people don't come back. Not because they can't, but because they're no longer part of your life. That day, I came home, put my backpack down, and lit a small candle on the windowsill. I don't know why, it just felt right. A mark, a transition from one version of myself to another. For the first time, I allowed myself pride. Pride in survival, in the decisions I made without anything, in not breaking down when he sat across from me. I was no longer a lost girl, abandoned by them, not a ghost of their history. I had become a woman with my own life. A few weeks later, I was unpacking an old duffel bag that hadn't opened since the orphanage. At the bottom, in a torn pocket, I found a crumpled napkin. On it, my shaking hands had written the first drafts of my job description. Diner, night shift, warehouse, CJ, hardware store, Lisa. My entire new life began with those 3 lines. I looked at it for a long time, not with pain, but with a sense of rootedness, not in suffering, but in assent. I placed the napkin in a simple frame, not as a trophy, not out of revenge, as a memory of that girl the world deemed unnecessary. She survived. She became me. That evening, Evan came over with Thai food and a bottle of cider. Noticing the frame as soon as he stepped through the door, he quietly asked, "What is this?" "My first root," I smiled. He grinned. "Hang it next to your diploma?" "What diploma?" I laughed. "You're the most successful dropout I've ever met," he replied, and we clinked glasses. We settled on the couch, my couch, the one I'd bought with my own money. We ate too much food, watched a stupid action movie, and moaned together. He didn't ask about my family, not because he didn't care, but because he knew I'd tell him myself when I was ready. I now allowed this kind of love in my life, quiet, respectful, free. The following months were like building a house on solid ground. Freelancing grew into stable projects, and I launched a small agency helping people start over, just as I once did. I assembled a team of 3 talented people the world had underestimated. Every week, I taught masterclasses at a local tech hub. Many came from scratch, some from shelters, some from the streets, some carrying the weight of family trauma. In their eyes, I saw the same hunger, the same weariness, and the spark of hope that had once been in me. They asked, "How did you start?" I answered simply, "I was abandoned once, and I built myself anew. Not for revenge, not for them, for myself." I didn't seek apologies. I found strength. I didn't return to them. I moved forward into a life where they had no power. Sometimes someone writes from their hometown, "Your dad looked bad. Chase mentioned you. Mom cried in church." I don't answer. Not out of cruelty, out of freedom. The girl abandoned in the gas station sun died then. The woman who grew out of her owes nothing to anyone. They can tell their stories. I'm too busy with mine. I live in a loft with the kind of floor-to-ceiling windows I once dreamed of. I run an agency, helping people find their way out of the darkness. Every evening, I return to a person who respects me not for what I've been through, but for who I've become. Every morning, I wake up with one thought. They thought they'd break me. But some of us don't break. We build anew. And when closed doors no longer open, we build better ones. And we light a bigger fire.